Samsung recently dethroned Apple as the top smartphone seller by volume in the first quarter of 2024, selling more smartphones than any other company in the world.
Samsung beats Apple to become the world's biggest smartphone brand. In the first quarter of 2024, iPhone sales dropped drastically.
Now, the latest data from research firm IDC reveals that Apple's smartphone shipments plummeted by 10% in the first quarter of 2024.
iPhone sales in China down 24% year on year for the first 6 weeks of 2024.
According to a report by IDC, Apple saw a 10% decline in Q1 of 2024 in global smartphone shipments. Its market share dropped to just 17.3%, and Samsung, on the other hand, had the largest share of the pie at 20.8%. Most of the drop for Apple actually happened in China, the largest market for Apple after the US, where iPhone sales dropped by almost 25% in the first 6 weeks of 2024 alone. Apple might as well have opened an office in Wuhan, because their problems in China have been multiplying like COVID. Not only is it being a victim of the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, but it is also seeing an unexpected competition from many new brands, more of which I will cover later in the video. But what I find surprising is that while the outcry about Apple losing its top position is so high, no one is mentioning how Samsung hasn't really dethroned Apple. It has just taken back what it already owned before. From 2012 to 2022, Samsung was the undisputed leader of the smartphone market by volume. It had been selling more phones than any other company in the world for over 10 years. It lost to Apple only in 2023, and now it is back at the top again. So now, you might be wondering, is Apple finally losing its mojo in the absence of Steve Jobs? How does Samsung manage to hold the top spot year after year for over a decade? And if Samsung sells more smartphones than Apple, then why is it Apple that is the second most valuable company in the world? The answer to this last question was the one that surprised me the most, and I'll get to that later in the video. But first, let's understand how Samsung and Apple have gotten to the place where they are today. In 1998, Nokia had overtaken Motorola as the largest phone seller in the world, with the Nokia 3310 alone selling over 126 million units. It was one of the most successful phones of all time. By 2007, the company made over half of all the phones sold in the world. For 14 years, Nokia continued to dominate the global mobile phone market, but in 2012, Nokia was finally dethroned by Samsung. Now, the reason why Nokia managed to lose its monopoly is a case study for business schools, but I will explain that to you very briefly. You see, 2007 was the year when the first iPhone was unveiled to the world, and this was at a time when traditional feature phones were the norm. Smartphones were a new concept. But even by the end of 2007, Nokia smartphones accounted for 50% of all smartphones sold in the world, while Apple held a mere 5% market share. And the first smartphone from Samsung, the Samsung Galaxy GT i7500, wasn't even launched until June 2009. So if it was not for the competition, how did Nokia lose its market dominance in just a few years? Well, while the rise of Samsung and Apple certainly did not help, Nokia's downfall was primarily because it shot itself in the foot with a couple of very crucial decisions. The first was misreading the market and ignoring the Android platform. You see, by the late 2000s, it had become very clear that iOS and Android were emerging to be the most promising mobile operating systems. However, Nokia was that overconfident child in the classroom who thought it knew better than what the market was telling it, and it continued using its own Symbian OS for a very long time. Have you heard of Symbian OS? No, right? Well, that's because it was an absolute failure that died a slow, painful death. People born in the 80s and 90s would know this, since they were a first-hand witness. You see, Nokia was able to maintain its dominance until 2007 because of its success with hardware. It had cracked how to build dependable hardware which made its phone reliable and durable. And initially, the functionality of software in any phone was so limited that there wasn't a lot of scope for improvement. But as hardware evolved and became powerful enough to support unbelievably good software, Nokia underestimated the importance of software and user interface. It failed to adapt. And the second blunder was that when Nokia finally decided to abandon Symbian and switch to a new OS, it still neglected Android and went with Microsoft Windows Mobile OS instead. So the smartphone revolution essentially ended Nokia as a company, and two new powers emerged: Apple with its iPhone and Samsung with its Galaxy smartphones. Now you might be wondering, If Samsung and iPhone both launched around the same time, why was it Samsung that became the best selling smartphone brand and not the iPhone? Well, that is because the strategy and targeting of Samsung and Apple have been very different right from the beginning. Apple has always positioned its products as premium, aspirational devices that command a higher price point, and the iPhone was no different. Samsung, on the other hand, recognized early that it won't be just rich people using smartphones. There would eventually be a smartphone in the pocket of almost every person walking on the earth, no matter whether they are rich or poor. So it has always made smartphones catering to all market segments, from entry-level smartphones like the Samsung Galaxy A02 to luxury phones like the Galaxy S series. And each of them got the results that they expected. Samsung became the company selling the highest number of smartphones that people buy for their price and utility. Apple got a narrower but much more loyal market for the iPhone that values design and brand, and the integrated ecosystem that Apple offers with the iCloud, watchOS, and macOS. But after reading all of this, I wondered that if Samsung ships out more phones than any other company, why is it Apple and not Samsung that is the second most valuable company today? And when searching for the answer, I came across the much larger ball game that Apple has been playing. If you made it this far, please subscribe to my channel. I promise my content will add value for you. Moving on. I estimated that while Samsung may be selling a higher quantity of phones, the fact still remains that the average phone sold by Apple is much more expensive than the average phone sold by Samsung. And my estimate was proved right by data. In 2023, while the average selling price of a phone by Samsung was just $228, it was almost $900 for Apple, over 3 times more than Samsung. And this has been the trend for a very long time now. Since 2018, while the average selling price for all other brands has always been below $300, Apple has hovered around the $800 mark, gradually increasing it to $900 last year by jacking up their prices even further. The result is that the revenue and the profit that Apple makes per phone is much higher than any other company in the world. In India alone, while the iPhone has a mere 6% share by the number of units sold, it has the highest revenue share at 23% of the market. On the other hand, Samsung's market share by units sold in India was almost 3 times that of iPhone at 18%, but its revenue share was still lower at 21%. In fact, 2023 was the first time that the iPhone captured 50% of global revenues. iPhone literally owns half of the smartphone market in the world today by revenue. And since profit is the ultimate goal of any company, the stock market only cares about the money that you are bringing in, and not so much about how many units you are selling. And this is one of the main reasons why Apple is the second most valuable company in the world and not Samsung. So then, the fact that Samsung lost the top position in the market share by units sold to Apple last year should be even more concerning for Samsung, right? I mean, the only place where you were leading was the number of units sold, and now you are managing to lose that as well to Apple. Well, Samsung is not really concerned because this was not an accident, but a well thought out strategic move. As I already explained, the ultimate goal of any company is to get revenue. The number of units sold can be pointless. And Samsung has now finally realized that what Apple does is much better. They make less effort to sell fewer phones and still make a higher profit. So Samsung decided to follow the same path as Apple. They realized that selling phones in the affordable segment has now become a race to the bottom and exited the segment altogether. See, the customers in the affordable segment don't really care about brand value or loyalty. All they want is the cheapest smartphone with maximum features. And since anyone can come in, compromise on quality, and offer a cheaper phone to the customers, it is extremely difficult to compete in the affordable segment of smartphones. And this is proved by data. In Q1 of 2024, both Samsung and Apple lost market share by volume. Samsung by 0.7% and Apple by 9.6%. The market share was actually gobbled up by Xiaomi, which grew its share by 33.8%, and Transsion, the company that owns the Techno and Infinix brands, which grew its share by 84.9%. And both of these companies largely cater to the affordable segment. So Samsung realized that catering to the affordable segment is doing more harm than good. And from 2023, it strategically pivoted to mid-range and flagship models. And this was why it temporarily lost its position as the highest smartphone seller by volume to Apple for 2023. But the strategy has worked out well so far for Samsung. And that is also why they were able to take back their position from Apple in Q1 of 2024. Samsung leads the foldable phone segment, and their flagship S24 smartphones did 8% better in sales than last year's S23. It has sold over 60 million smartphones from the S24 series this year alone. So now, you know why Samsung was the market leader by units sold for the last 10 years, why Apple was the actual winner by being the market leader in revenue, and why Samsung experienced a one-year dip in sales last year, which it managed to get back this year. The only question that remains is, what is the future of Apple? Because when you look at this data, it tells you that Apple has indeed experienced a fall of 10% in sales, which would impact its revenue as well. It was the biggest drop in iPhone sales since COVID lockdowns, which caused global supply chain chaos in 2022. So why is this happening with Apple? Well, a large part of it is the troubles that Apple is now facing in China. As I already said earlier, China is the largest market for iPhone after the US, but Apple has been stumbling a lot in China recently, where iPhone sales dropped by almost 25% in the first 6 weeks of 2024 alone. And the decline is because it is facing pushback on two fronts. The first is from local Chinese players who are now increasingly giving stiff competition to Apple. Huawei, a company that also caters to the premium smartphone market in China with phones like the Mate 60 Pro, increased its sales by 64% in the first 6 weeks of 2024, the same period where iPhone sales dropped by 25%. And the second pushback is from the Chinese government itself. Apple is essentially being crushed by the rivalry between the US and the Chinese government, both of which are engaged in a pseudo-trade war. The US has been acting out against China for quite some time now, where it has put Huawei and ZTE, two Chinese tech giants, on a list that severely restricts their capability to do business with the US. It is also planning to ban TikTok in the US or force its sale to American shareholders. And it has restricted Nvidia from exporting certain GPUs to China so it doesn't win the AI race. And China has finally started retaliating. Last year, it banned government officials from using the iPhone, and it has also asked Apple to remove WhatsApp and Threads from its Chinese app store. And the final problem is that global demand for high-end phone upgrades is now slowing down, which basically means that fewer people are now looking to buy new premium smartphones. So does that mean that Apple is now losing its edge? Well, after my research, I came up with a very interesting answer to this question. Quarterly performance is a very short-term metric to measure the performance of any company. And if you look at Apple, it is still holding strong when it comes to market share by revenue. And the secret to Apple's resilience is actually not just the iPhone. Apple has two very strong moats or barriers that it has established for its competition. The first is the ecosystem that Apple has created for its users. The seamless integration between the iPhone, iPad, MacBook, iWatch, and the AirPods is very difficult to replace. Steve Jobs was always of the opinion that they would keep their products within a tightly knit ecosystem. No other company but Apple exercises end-to-end control. And in the Apple ecosystem, everything is owned by Apple. The hardware, the software, and the OS. But that is not the case with any other company in the world. Its next biggest competitor, Samsung, cannot offer a comprehensive ecosystem like Apple even if it wanted to. Their phones run on Google's Android, and their laptops, which aren't very popular anyway, run on Windows. Now, what this Apple ecosystem does is it creates a very high switching cost for the user. If you are in the Apple ecosystem and you decide to sell your iPhone, you are not just letting go of your phone, but a seamless integration of all your digital devices. But that is not true for Samsung. There is almost no integration between Windows laptops and Android phones. And there is no cost of switching from a Samsung phone to any other phone in the market. And the second barrier is the incredible brand loyalty that Apple has established. People pay 3 times higher for an iPhone than an average Android phone for a reason. Apple has created a powerful brand image associated with innovation, quality, and luxury. This not only attracts first-time buyers, but also ensures a high rate of customer retention. Samsung, despite being technologically superior, often sees its brand perception diluted by its diversity, ranging from budget phones to flagship products, which can sometimes send mixed signals about its brand identity. So while Apple faces immediate challenges, particularly in China, the strong brand loyalty, superior revenue per unit, and tightly integrated ecosystem give it a unique market leadership position in terms of revenue, if not in unit sales. Let me know in the comments whether Apple is overrated or not. Subscribe here and follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram. The link is in the description below. Until I see you in the next video, goodbye.